Come on, recording. There you go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Practical Graphic Design for Libraries. I'm Jamie Machek with the Nicolet Federated Library System, and as you saw on the pre-show slide, our partner is the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, also with us today. Welcome, all of you, to this presentation. Very happy that we have Aaron Schmidt with us today. He is the principal at Influx, and they are a company that focuses on web design, user experience, web writing, usability, do some really great things. And I think you're really going to enjoy today's presentation. So without further ado, Aaron, whenever you're ready.
Great. Thanks for the intro, Jamie, and thanks to you all for being here. This is a really good topic for us to all be talking about and learn more about. This is going to be some practical graphic design basics today. People spend many years in college learning about graphic design, and then people spend a lot of their careers refining their abilities. So this is a topic that a lot of people go deep with. I don't anticipate that any of us will go as deep as others. However, there's still a lot of stuff we can do, even if we're not super experts at graphic design, to make our libraries more effective communicators, and I would say more beautiful places to be. There is a scourge of sometimes not so great looking signage and other print materials in libraries, and we can make our libraries more pleasant as a result. And I think that's a good value in and of itself, something to strive for. But I also think that having a professional presentation of our communications can increase trust among users and make people just want to use our services more. So let's get to it. Oh, and I will say that feel free just to type in any questions, and Jamie will pass those on to me as we are in the presentation here, and I'll answer them when I can. So we've got some concepts I want to talk about that I think will be useful for you to help assess and improve stuff in your library. I've got a few things to say about just a higher level planning for making these improvements. And lastly, we've got some good examples of pretty stuff in libraries, and nice examples that we can be inspired by. So quick introduction here. A lot of different areas in libraries, a lot of different touch points that today's lessons can be applied to. Be talking about websites a little bit, print stuff quite a bit, and I've got some examples from many different types of touch points, but it's clear that we do a lot of visual communicating, and we can talk about that today. Here is a breakdown of different sorts of signage in libraries. So even among just this like one category of library signs there at the end, we see different sorts of signs. We have signs that want to change the way people behave. We have signs that are meant to direct people to certain places, signs that identify things like the reference desk, signs to help people use, say, the photocopier machine, instructional signs, all sorts of different things going on here. That's a good thing to keep in mind. And like I mentioned before, we've got some not so great signs and graphic treatments in our buildings and online. So here's a pretty bad example. This sign is actually quite mean, right? So we've got a bad attitude in this sign, as well as being not so great graphically, and it can be improved. And it doesn't take too terribly much to change this into something better, and I've got some examples of that later. So just another kind of blah sign. It's not, maybe it's effective. Good contrast on this sign, but could be improved. And here we have something that's funny. I often note when there are signs on signs, and here's an example of that. So just some examples of things that could be better, and the goal is to change something like this into something like this. This more effectively communicates. This has some library branding. This happens to have a better attitude as well. And I do think that if you spend some time practicing principles that I'll talk about today, you will be capable of redesigning signs into something more pleasant and better. So If your library sort of looks like this, you're not alone, and let's do something about that. Also, I guess I'll just say that as pretty as you can make a sign, and your newsletters and bookmarks, etc., keep in mind that the more print stuff you have on display in a space, the less effective, in a way, any one component of those things can be. When you put up additional signs, when you put out additional displays, it can create a lot of visual noise. So I guess I am advocating here for making the individual pieces of all of this look better, and also being judicious about what exactly it is you're putting out there in general, so that people can see and notice all the great stuff that you are putting out there. So just want to advocate here for sort of reducing the overall load of printed stuff around libraries. All right, so here are some major concepts that I want to talk about. And if we employ all of these things and think about all of these things and assess the signage in terms of these things and improve them where they can be improved, then we're going to be in a much better place with print stuff in our buildings. So let's get to it. Oh, and I guess I'll say, as we talk about all these things, when you're communicating visually on a poster or a sign, I want you to think about information hierarchy. What's the most important thing for someone to know about what you're trying to communicate, and how should you display that? What are the less important but still important things, and how should those be arranged? So all these concepts, I think, can reinforce and help communicate effectively through information hierarchy. Okay, so alignment. Look around your library at all of your things that have been designed and look for the edges on things. And so what do I mean by edges? And I'm advocating here for creating strong edges. So this, we'll go back to this little example. This edges on here are a little bit weaker, or they're not very well defined because the justification is center justified on this. Now, this is a pretty minor sign and a pretty minor thing, but it's a fine example of how the edges aren't very strong on this. And also, this center justification is causing some problems too. We've got not a real strong edge going on here, especially with the clip art that's happening. And I guess I'm generally not too big of a fan of clip art, although these kind of cups and dishes are cute. Also, we're seeing an alignment problem here, and there's not a very strong edge. And if you noticed in my redesign, I left justified things. That just makes this sign easier to read if it was left justified. So alignment is an important thing, and this is just one way that you can assess what's going on with your print stuff. And I mean, to be honest, even if this sign was just left justified, it would be slightly better. So when you're making new things, consider left-hand justification. It's pretty much the easiest thing to read. And I'm not saying all center justification is wrong. It can be used effectively, and I think I've got some slides of that later on, but defaults to left-hand justification. And here we have just some more bad edges that are sloppily aligned. And this is another example of a very, very small correction here on the bottom, changing that URL and actually taking away the www and just left justifying that URL at the top. Again, this is not going to solve every problem in a library. I'm not claiming that, but just an example of a small thing that can improve the layout on this library card. And again, I definitely want to acknowledge that this is a small detail for sure, but I think that small details like this add up and as an aggregate present a more professional, better looking, cohesive communication program in a library. Okay, another library card thing here. Left-hand justification might not work very well on the bottom example. So here is an example where right-hand justification can work a little bit better. So just a quick redesign. And this has all sorts of issues, this library card, and just justifying things over to the left and making some spacing stuff out a little bit better helps this card. Again, it's not perfect and looks pretty dated, right? But just some examples of how changing justification can make some slight improvements. I think this is a great example of how messing with justification and improving it and playing around with it can really help communicate. On top here, the before, all that stuff below the name of the library is pretty hard to scan and skim. Takes a while to get through that information. Then if we look at the quick redesign on the bottom there, information is chunked together in a bit more of an effective way, and it's a little bit easier to read as a whole. Okay, so that's a little bit about creating strong edges, and I've used this term justification. This is something familiar probably to most of us. I mean, you can change justification in any word processing program or desktop publishing program, but just to put a definition on it. So on the upper left here, we have a full justification where things are spanning across the whole column. Upper right, we've got center justification, and then left and right justification on the bottom. Just concepts that I want to make sure that you are comfortable with and aware of. And again, let's default to this. It's the easiest one to get right. So how does this play out in practice? Let's just look at some examples and why left-hand justification works better. Here we have center justification. It's just not as, it just doesn't work as well. But here's my example of center justification working for something. Center justification can lend an air of formality to a poster, and that's something to think about. So this is a pretty nice layout here on this. It can be done well. That's my little caveat, I guess. Here we have a right-hand justification that is fine, but this is not how, say, books are laid out, right? It's a little bit harder for the eye to find where to go when it goes to a new line because of the ragged edge on the left, and it's easier when the ragged edge is on the right, like this. So, like I said, this is a basic thing, but worth thinking about. Now, something that you might be a little less familiar with is the concept of proximity and how proximity can impact how we understand a visual communication in a page layout. And it has a lot to do with the organization, and we can organize a document through proximity and make it more intelligible. So here we have a hypothetical menu here, and we can see there are actually some headings here, but they're given equal value as the items that are, I guess, underneath them. And if we just chunk the information in a little bit different of a way here through some indentation, we're changing the alignment and proximity, and instantly this document is communicating a little bit better than this, right? So proximity can be really effective. And if we combine this with some other changes, this sample menu here becomes even more effective. And I've got some examples of that coming up. So another library card example. This has some proximity issues. It also has a lot of typefaces going on, different font typeface weights. We'll talk about that in a minute too. So just a quick redesign of this card, chunking the like information together, spacing it all out in a more effective way, making good use of justification on the left and the right, makes this card feel a bit calmer, and it communicates more effectively. So let's talk about scale too. We're not going to leave proximity behind. I'll bring back some more information about proximity, but I want to talk about that in conjunction with other things. So let's talk about scale, and this is a good one. Also very important for information hierarchy. So you don't want something too small, and you don't want something too big. You can use extremes effectively, but again, it's probably a bit more, it's a bit easier to get it right when you're a bit more in the middle of the road. So here is something that does not have any scale. And again, kind of like the menu example, you can't differentiate between the heading and the actual like paragraph content here. And here I've gone to the other extreme, and this just doesn't feel right either. But nice middle of the road scale where the headings are an effective size, so you can skim and read those, and you know that there's information relevant to that heading underneath it. So check out your scale as well. Just a quick comparison here. I think it's pretty easy to agree that the example on the right is probably a bit more effective and looks nicer than the one on the left. So again, here we have an unscaled example, and this I think is an interesting kind of quandary here, or an interesting emphasis here. I don't know for sure the answer to this because I just pulled this image off the web, but to me this library card is really emphasizing the library system rather than the individual library, and I would guess that probably people connect a little bit more with their individual libraries and systems. You know, not talking bad about library consortia at all, but you know, I would like on this card maybe to see the library name be a bit more emphasized rather than the system. Here we have a scale problem of individual letters. The L and the C are kind of way out of scale and too big here, and then the name of the library is very small. So yeah, maybe actually a library card doesn't even need to be on the library card at all. So here is an example of something that is a bit more scaled, a bit more even, looks a little better. Just a quick example. And like I said, messing with scale and fooling around with it and subverting expectations can provide an interesting, effective result. This is probably one of the most famous examples of scale being used effectively in this layout or to sell something. This was a pretty famous campaign, pretty clever, but it takes some skill to do something like this. Okay, so that's a bit on scale. Let's talk about contrast here. And here we're getting into some content about color, and this is a really important one because well, having adequate contrast in your documents is good for everyone, but it's especially good for people that might be hard of sight, though I would argue that everyone benefits from effective contrast as well. It has a lot to do with making things visible and legible, and if things are visible and legible, they're definitely more effective. So here's an example of some bad contrast, definitely depending on what sort of projector or monitor you're looking at right now for this slide. It's probably a bit more difficult to see the word contrast than it should be, right? Here are some different scales of contrast. We go from low contrast all the way up to pretty high contrast at the bottom there. And if you just kind of glance at the screen and glance away, your eye will naturally go toward the bottom because that is a higher contrast situation there. If you Google around, you can find some examples of high contrast color combinations and low contrast color combinations. And there also are some tools on the web that you can use to evaluate the contrast of your website. If you search for a WebAIM or the Wave accessibility tool, you can put in your URL and it will scan the values that you use and tell you probably that you should make your font size larger, and if you have any contrast issues, it will suggest improvements there. So if you're concerned about your website being adequately accessible, contrast is definitely something to think about. And I can send out links to those tools to Jamie, and she can share those with you along with the slides if you're interested in those. When you're out and about in public places, pay attention to signage programs, and especially in airports, because airport signage is pretty effective moving people around, and you'll often see really high contrast values there. So yellow and white letters on black, you'll see, or white letters on blue, you'll see quite a bit. So keep your eyes peeled there and bring in any good ideas you see to your own situation. So even if something is scaled appropriately, if it's bad contrast, that it is less effective, right? So all these things need to work together to make the best sort of graphic treatment that we can. If any one of these things falls down, whether it's scale or contrast or proximity, it can make your design less effective overall. So these things should be working in harmony. Here are some examples from a website. I'm in Portland, and this is my home library. Overall, this is an okay homepage, I think, but this homepage suffers from some contrast problems for sure. I like that this has a search box at the front and center, taking up some important screen real estate there. I think that's really appropriate, but the image underneath this screen in the background really hurts the design of this page overall. And I think it's a good thing to have some attractive imagery as part of a page layout, definitely, but not at the expense of any legibility and usability in this way. Also, I think there's a contrast problem in the main navigation there. If you look closely, there's a gradient from a darker blue to a lighter blue in the navigation bar there, and that combined with the drop shadow on those words makes it a little bit harder to read than I think it should be. So I don't know. I would prefer that this page be the stuff in the foreground of this page be less transparent and be more defined. So this quick redesign, this iteration, is certainly less engaging, right? It looks plain, it looks kind of blah, and it looks stark, but it definitely has more legibility and readability. So how can we take something like this and introduce a bit more visual interest into it? Well, this could be one effective way. Separate these things out. And again, maybe this page overall is not as engaging. This is not meant to be the final right answer. Oh, I think this homepage should look like this. It's just an iteration, and this is actually a concept that I hope you will employ. You don't have to get a design right the first time. In fact, you probably won't get it right the first time, but it's totally okay to play around, make a bunch of different iterations, see what's working and see what's not, and end up with the best design. So instead of this kind of informational slider here underneath the search box, that could go below here. The page is looking a lot plainer now, and I believe it's probably easier to use in the long run than the home page, the current home page. Just another example here. Also, on their interior pages, just wanted to highlight a contrast issue. And actually, I did not run this page through the contrast evaluator, but I'm really sure that the values would be red flagged. So this kind of dark gray, almost black text on a beige background is going to be low contrast. And this page is definitely drastically improved, greatly improved by just fixing the contrast issue there. Okay, so here we have a scale again. And let's talk about scale and proximity and contrast and all these things. So here we have our hypothetical menu. We've got some more contrast between the headings and the items that should be underneath them. So that's good, but the proximity is way off now, right? Things are weird there. And if we align them a bit better, create some more appropriate chunking and proximity, this menu is shaping up for sure. A little bit of indentation helps, and we see all these things working together to make this menu easier to understand. And if we add some scale into the mix, maybe it's a little bit better. So that's how all those things can work together to improve a page layout. Some color combinations just don't work. It's true. This should look pretty harsh to you. This is very disagreeable to me. So this is maybe a high contrast situation, but it looks bad, and it's also really bad for people with various types of color blindness, right? So be on the lookout for bad color combos as well, and there are some sites that you can use to get more pleasant color combos if you need some inspiration for making whether it's an individual poster or a sign, or you're looking for an overall sort of color scheme to use repeatedly, which is a very good strategy. You can check out Adobe Color. There are all sorts of color palettes there. This is also a really good one, Color Lovers, and you can browse some nice combos that people have put together and see if anything catches your eye. Okay, let's move on and talk about typography a little bit. This is definitely fundamental to graphic design, and here are some basic concepts. So there are a zillion typefaces out there, right? How do you know which one to use? Is there a right one to use? Is there a wrong one to use? It's not exactly that simple, but let's talk about it. So here we have a serif typeface. This is a concept that probably most of us know about. These little bits on the letters are serifs, and they are, I guess, a bit of a decoration on a letter. And here we have a sans serif typeface that is missing those things. Again, one is not better than the other. Some of them might be, a serif typeface might be appropriate in one place, and a sans serif might be more appropriate in another. They do give different feelings, right? Oftentimes serif typefaces might be a bit more formal and, say, stately. Sans serif typeface might be more fresh and modern. All depends on what sort of vibe you're hoping to give off in the document that you're creating. So here are a couple examples of serif typefaces. Here are a couple sans serif typefaces. And another concept to learn about and to spend some time experimenting with are the different weights of typefaces. So actually, this slide got messed up. This is not Futura. This is like a joke slide now, because this is actually the typeface Helvetica. It's supposed to be Futura, and this one as well, for some reason, is not working right. Hopefully, my next slides will illustrate, but you can kind of see a little bit here that the first three are lighter and less bold than the ones below. Likewise here. This is actually a little bit of a low contrast slide, isn't it? But play around with font weights. Man, I'm really sorry. Hopefully the slides I sent to Jamie feature this correctly. If not, I'll correct it and send it out. Not sure why it's doing that. But here's an example from the real world why font weights are important. We see a bunch of different font weights here, and actually a bunch of different typefaces as well. We see some that are pretty bold, some that are pretty light, and getting a system in place for being, I guess, mindful and intentional about when you're employing a bolder typeface versus a regular one is a good thing, and it can really calm down the page, or in this case, a library card. All right, pairing. How do you pair together typefaces effectively? Here we have a bad example of this. We see a lot of different typefaces here. In the seal in the upper left, we've got one, and then to the right of that, we've got two. Then it looks like we've got a bold version of that below, so that's three, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers logo is four. That is that's too many, and it's hard to, the more typefaces you introduce into a document, the harder it is to get them all working well together. So here are some good combos and bad combos, and luckily these actually are working well here. So the examples in red I would avoid, because it is pairing two serif typefaces together and two sans serif typefaces together, and they're kind of competing in this way. If you're going to pair together different typefaces, consider that they are different types, because the feeling of that is just a bit easier to read and a bit more intelligible in a way. So there are some examples there. And if you are desperate for a new library logo, here are some words of advice. Number one, don't hold a contest for a new library logo, because the results of those oftentimes aren't great. And if you have done that and have any horror stories to share, I would enjoy hearing about that. Keep it simple. If you want a new library logo, consider creating what's just called a word mark. Choose some typefaces, make a real nice treatment there, and that's pretty much all you need. Here are just some variations, playing around. Again, none of this is totally exactly what I would do, say, in an implementation, but just some examples of how you might sketch out and play around creating a word mark for your library. If you want to look for some nice typeface pairings and nice typefaces in general, here are a couple of resources. This one is called Just My Type. You can see some good collections there. And I mean, there are just a ton of typeface resources. Typography.com is one to check out, all sorts of neat things. Linotype is a type foundry that creates and distributes typefaces. And I may have mentioned Typekit before. If you want to get some nice typography on your website, there are tools that will help you do this. Typekit is a product by Adobe that lets you bring in nice typefaces to your website. Don't need to go overboard with it, and you definitely don't need, you know, a super fancy typeface to make a nice looking website, but it can help. Also, Google has a free service that's similar to Typekit. So again, just like when we're talking about scale, when it comes to typefaces, you don't want things too big and you don't want things too small. Here we have an example of some headings and some body copy again, and here we have it a little bit zoomed in, a little bit bigger. Evaluate your website, and I would say ensure that the font size you're using is at least 16 pixels big. I review a decent amount of library websites, and I would say 90% of the time sites are using typefaces in like 11 pixels or 12 pixels, 13, and that's way too small. It takes too much effort to read a screen with words that small. So bump that up, and that's a surefire way to improve the graphic design of your website. I really like grids. Grid systems and graphic design are a great tool to make sure alignment is good and to make sure that pages have a rhythm and are easier to understand. And when you employ a grid, it's easier to get things right. So here's an example of something that is not effectively using a grid at all. And again, if we use a grid to align all these things, it's just a better layout, more effective communication happening here. If you want to check out some great grid systems in use, click around all of the BBC's websites. They have a grid system that they use throughout all of their web properties, and there are a lot of them. And it's a really cool example of effectively communicating in this way. And they also have a document laying out all of their graphic design treatments through this style guide. They call it the global experience language, and they have detailed out how all this stuff should look. This way, you know, they're not reinventing the wheel each time they make a new web property or a new web page. They have guides for how it should look. They've done the work once, they apply it across the board, and everything looks cohesive and communicates well. So it's worth looking at for sure. So just some ways you can use grids. You can use grids to make different column widths. You can then have your graphic stuff also use the same grids. This is just a nice way to create some alignment and a good feeling on your pages. So speaking of column widths, you don't want something too wide like this, when I read this or when someone reads this, their eyes are sort of tired by the time they get to the end of this line, end of the line, and it's like in a certain way they can't remember what they were just reading. You definitely don't want it too narrow either. You know, this layout looks more like a passage of poetry than it does a web page. This is too busy. Your eyes are too busy going from one end of the line to the beginning of the next too many times. So, like scale and other things, you want to choose something that is a kind of more middle of the road for column widths. One way to think about it on a website or in print things is a column width could be about 40 to 80 characters wide. Now this is a very rough guideline, and it depends on what size typeface you're using or what size font you're using, obviously. But if you wanted to just have a rough guideline for counting the number of characters in a column, that is something that you could use. So kind of like column width, going the opposite way, we can look at different sorts of line height. And again, I mean, I'd hate to sound so boring, always advocating for something in the middle of the road. But you can see here that pretty hard to read the one on the left. The one on the right also looks a bit off, takes up a lot of space as well. The one in the middle is more accustomed to what we're seeing, and it's probably what we want to be using the majority of the time. Now, in a more experimental, more artsy, we could say, layout, something like on the left or the right could work in a certain context for sure, but for your typical library document, something in the middle works better. So here are a couple examples of a lot of this in play. Here we have get a library card page, DC Public Library website. This page is not appropriately written for the web. There are some blocks of text that are way too big. Information isn't chunked in an effective way, and proximity isn't really being used very much. Here is a redesign of that. We can see scale at play with the effective page title. We can see contrast at play with black on white. We can see some font weights in play with the questions, the headings in a bolder font, and the related information in a more regular weight underneath it. This is a more effective way to communicate on the web. It allows people to scan in a more effective way, find the information they want, read it, and move on. Here's another example. Wow, a impenetrable wall of text here. Really hard to get at this information. Also, the typeface is probably way too small on this. And I appreciate that they want to introduce some aesthetic value with the image and show the library. I think that's great, but it throws off this whole page. So here is a redesign of that. The image layout is more effective, lets the reader go through this page in an easier way. And again, we see an similar question and answer format with the effective use of font weights and proximity spacing here. Another example, this page has a lot of stuff going on in general. It's got a kind of distracting sidebar on the right, and not to get too deep into the problems of this page, but those like words on the right in purple on a purple background, contrast problem there. Also, those things look exactly like the links on the left hand navigation, and that's a problem. Everything that is a link should look the same, and nothing else should look like a link, so that's an issue. So just some iterations of this page. So removing elements helps, changing the scale of the section of the website helps a little bit, removing that sidebar, which is kind of didn't really have much useful information anyway, definitely helps calm this page down. And there's the notification back. Again, the typeface or the font size for this is probably way too small. It should be bigger. But looking at the before and after, we can see that just by removing some elements, playing with scale a little bit, we see a page that feels more calm and more readily directs one's eye to the main content. So here are some of those things in play. Another example. Overall, not a horrible looking page here, but a lot of elements going on, and the eye is distracted, and taking away some unnecessary elements, increasing the size of the fonts makes this page a much more effective communication tool. And these past few examples have been from the web, but same thing applies when you're creating a poster or flyer for your library. So here's a pretty drastic example of a library homepage, high contrast, very simple. I'm not suggesting that your homepage should be exactly this simple, but just a way to illustrate that stripping out a lot of the extraneous elements can focus a layout a lot. So I talked about iteration before, just showed some iterations of different things, and it really is a crucial concept. Give yourself the freedom to play around, spend some time iterating on designs, and you will end up with a better design in the end. So let's look at some iterations of this poor sign. So like I said before, just a left-hand justification improves it a little bit. I've increased the thank you. So I don't know if you noticed back here on the bottom right-hand of the sign, it says thank you, a really small font, de-emphasizing the thank you, right? So couldn't help myself, needed to make it bigger on this iteration. I've changed this to a sans serif typeface because I think at the scale it's a little bit easier to read and it just gives a sort of more modern feel, which I thought was good for this sign. I've changed some proximity here. I've used some different spacing. I've removed words to make it easier to read. Sign's still a little bit crabby though, right? And here is the iteration I showed earlier where we got some library branding. We've changed it to something positive. We have one sentence that is nicer. Here's another iteration. This holiday closure sign, the one at the top, you know, it's not horrible, but it's a little bit difficult to read. It might kind of looks more formal, and that could be nice for a sign like this. My iteration is below, where we have the information chunked out in a little bit easier of a way, and it's in a more bullet list format. And I think if you would show the sign on the bottom to 10 people for 2 seconds and show sign at the top to 10 people, 10 other people for 2 seconds, I bet you the comprehension levels for the sign below would be slightly higher. Here's a real life example of a redesign. So this was a public library in Iowa City that had this sign. Again, we've got some proximity issues, we've got some alignment issues, sort of have a little bit of an attitude issue on this sign. Contrast is okay, I guess, but some issues for sure. Here is their redesign, which I thought was just absolutely fantastic. Most importantly, I think the attitude of the sign has changed to something more friendly and something more collaborative and emphasizing help. And we've got a nice friendly typeface here. Center justification here is working great for me. I think it's fine. We got some library branding, so a really good job on this redesign at Iowa City Public Library. All right, so if you want to fix some signs and other things around your library, here are some high-level ideas for making that happen. And you know, in addition to playing around with all those concepts and producing better individual signs or bookmarks or flyers or display labels, etc., how can you get a grasp on everything that's happening graphically in your library? Well, a really effective way to do that is to create a signage audit and go around your library, and if you can't just take everything down, keep track of what signs you have. And it might be overwhelming, and that's okay. So if there are any signs you can get rid of, I would say do that before you do the signage audit, so you don't need to catalog them all. But if you have a spreadsheet filled with what signs you have in your library, you can then have a greater understanding of what it is you're trying to communicate and what needs improving. You can also use a scale like this to start evaluating whether your signs are beautiful and friendly, and they should all be we should all be aiming for signs in that upper right-hand quadrant, right? We definitely don't want ugly, mean signs. We want friendly, beautiful signs. So this is one way to evaluate signs and other graphic things in your library. Looking for alignment and using templates and in your websites is a really important tool. Any sort of content management system, any sort of tool you're using to make your website, if you has templates built in, you can alter those if you've got the technical chops to do that, but just using templates in general, and like I showed on the BBC, doing the design once and applying that across the board is effective. And you can do that in print as well. So you can come up with some 3 or 4 perhaps basic designs for signs and bookmarks in your library and keep using those over and over. If you want to test the effectiveness of a signage program in your library, whether that's identificational sign or regulatory sign, whatever, you can do a real-world usability test of your physical space. If you were really curious about this and if it was important, you can get some people that have never been to your space, never been to your library, put them at the front door and ask them to go do something. You can say, okay, if you wanted to make a photocopy in the space, how would you do that? And you can see where they move, what signs they look at, what signs they ignore, and you can learn a lot from doing that. Okay, so some nice examples of graphic design and signage and stuff in libraries that hopefully will serve as some inspiration. I showed you that webpage from Edmonton Public Library before. Definitely check out the stuff that they do. They do a fantastic job putting their library branding scheme throughout the city of Edmonton. All of their libraries feature these colors, and they have nice bold signage on the exteriors of all their buildings. You can find a bunch of pictures online, and you can also take a look at this guideline. They have created a style guide, and they are explaining in the style guide what sort of core values and personalities they're hoping to communicate through their graphic design. They've got all their typography laid out. They've got their color palette laid out. You know, this is definitely an ultimate goal, making a document like this, but it's not necessary. You might not have the time or money to make a full branding guideline like this, but even laying it out in a couple pages can really help if you have multiple people making signs and other print materials for your library. They also have examples of the cool promotional items and swag that they create. They just do a really good job. So you can see they have even gone so far as to employ the colors, their color palette on this blow up slide, which is pretty neat. I saw recently that they have a necktie featuring the library colors, and the mayor of Edmonton was wearing the library color necktie, which is pretty cool. So some more good signage. This is a good concept in general, creating different zones in a library for different types of behavior, and this is a nice explanation of what the 4th floor zone is and what the 2nd floor zone is, say. Really neat signage program I observed in around Mexico. They sort of have a universal signage program for all libraries in this one state, the state of Hidalgo in Mexico. All libraries were using this signage program, which I thought was pretty effective and cool. Check out stuff from Anythink, the library system in Colorado. They do such a great job with all their print stuff and their graphic communications. Nice sign here. Another zoning example. Good contrast here. Nice, pretty big, legible sign illustrating that someone is in the business zone. Just want to run through some nice examples here. Again, this is pretty legible, emphasizing positive things versus what you can't do, right? I like this little human touch, the "it's easy" thing in parentheses there. Nice big coffee word on the wall. You know, in general, I'm not a fan of just taping up 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. Doesn't always look so great. It's sort of hard to do right, but putting it in a piece of, you know, an acrylic display and this nice sign here kind of elevates that a little bit. This is a cool example. The children's library, children's section of the main library in Copenhagen in Denmark, they have their own, what would you call it? Their own sort of graphic, their own theme, their own little characters, and they have a whole program based on these characters. Pretty neat thing. So just some more examples of nice signs. Neat program, nice graphic design here. Cool signs, nice series from Alberta, Canada, kind of edgy. Cool library logo here. San Rafael, pretty nice logo. You know, generally I'm like, oh, books, library logo featuring a book. It's like the easiest option, right? But I understand that it makes sense in some cases. I think this is a pretty good one. We helped them get their logo printed on bamboo library cards, which is a pretty cool thing for their community. Hey, close to home for you all in Wisconsin. I like this from Madison Public. I was born in Madison. Side note there. Some additional resources. So clearly sitting through this presentation has not made you yet an expert in assessing and improving your signs. If you want to continue your learning, here are some things to look at. The Non-Designer's Design Book, aside from having a sort of atrocious looking cover there, is actually a really good book. It deals with a lot of the issues that I talked about. It will show you more examples of proximity and alignment and scale and stuff like that. It's a really good resource, so check that out. If you want to geek out about grid systems, you can check out Grid Systems from Graphic Designer in Graphic Design by Joseph Müller-Brockmann, who's a famous Swiss typographer and layout expert. Making and Breaking the Grid is another nice book that is sort of like a little workbook for trying out some different exercises. And if you try these out, you can definitely apply those to when you're making new things and improving stuff in your library. Also, Chip Kidd, he designs a lot of book covers, and this is a great guide to his way of thinking about graphic design issues, and this is definitely worth your time looking at. And some tools for making this happen. So you can play around with scissors. You can literally cut and paste, copy and cut and paste stuff. If your computer skills are outmatched by your desire to improve signs, you can really just start playing around with different layouts by cutting up signs that you have in your library and playing around with the layout there before you transition to computers. I think that's totally fine. InDesign, Adobe InDesign is a kind of real heavyweight tool for page layout, so wanted to mention that. But things are a little bit easier to use. Check out Pages if you have Macs around your library. It's a pretty decent page layout program that you can use. Also, Keynote is for making presentations, but you can actually do a lot of great graphic design stuff within Keynote and export it as PDFs. So consider playing around with that if you have access to it. Sketch is a tool that you can use for taking screenshots, which I think can help a lot when you're making designs. So if you don't have a screenshot tool you like, check out Sketch. Also check out Lucid Press. It's a tool that you can use to create some page layouts that people have found helpful. And if you're into open source stuff, you can download Scribus, which is an open source page layout tool that you can download for free, play around with. Lastly, if you do use Max, Sketch is a pretty great tool. I think it costs $100, but you can do a lot of nice page layout stuff with it. And I'm pretty much at time now, so good timing there. I am up for some questions if you want to follow up on anything I talked about.
Awesome, Aaron. We did have a couple questions come in, and we do have a little bit of time, so we'll go through those now. Anne mentions, sometimes lack of images makes a page seem cold to me, such as changes on some of the web pages where the pictures of people were removed. How can we use pictures in our signs so they work graphically, or is the trend no photos or no images?
I think that's good. And you know, Jamie, I'm sorry, I told you I'd be monitoring the chat, and then I totally didn't
I didn't put a lot in. I didn't put a lot in there, so don't worry about it.
But I think the point about pictures is well taken. I think it's a good point. You know, the kind of iterations that I did for examples, I removed them just to, I guess, sort of emphasize how a page might feel calmer, or it's sort of easier to get right the fewer things you have on there. But I am in general a fan of images when used effectively. I would say my thoughts on that are as follows. Don't use too many. If you're going to use an image, make sure it's high quality. Use 1 or 2 images and get those right. I would rather see, you know, one really good image versus a few bad images. I sort of talked bad about clip art at the beginning, and I guess I'll reiterate that. You know, just putting a kind of crummy piece of clip art on a poster probably isn't going to add too much value, and it might just add as a distraction. So I would say don't be shy about using images, but just do it in an effective manner, and make sure it's, I guess, communicating what you want to communicate.
I think, you know, when in doubt, I've always heard that real library photos are the best, and then if you don't have those, at least, like you said, at least invest in some quality stock photos. You know, if you don't have the real photos that you can use. I mean, would you agree with that?
I would agree, and I have heard, and though I haven't really researched it too thoroughly, I have heard that on web pages, users have this like built-in BS detector and can somehow figure out whether the images are legit or not. So I do think using real library photos is important.
I would agree. You know, so you just did this great program on practical graphic design, and it had so many good ideas and so many good examples. Would you say if a library had some extra funds, is it worth it to invest some of those funds in possibly hiring a graphic designer or hiring someone who can help with some of this stuff professionally?
Yeah, I think so. Especially if other things are sort of buttoned up and working well, and there are some funds to do it, I would say getting a professional to come in and come up with a brand guideline that can then be implemented by the library is money really well spent. So, you know, I wouldn't bring someone in just to design a couple posters or design a newsletter or something like that, but coming up with an entire system that the library can then implement. I think that makes sense for sure.
I like what you said at the beginning. I mean, you showed some really basic examples of library cards, and you know, as you said, is this a big deal that the justification is off? No, but I forget what your exact comment was. How a lot of these small things can really add up to something big, you know, at the end if you keep seeing these types of things.
Yeah, no, I think that was my comment for sure. I think it definitely adds to a feeling of professionalism and builds trust with users.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We are out of time. As Aaron said, he will be sharing his slides with me and some of his resources, and I will make sure that those get up on our website as soon as I can. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining today's presentation. Thank you, Aaron, for a fabulous presentation, and I hope to see most of you in our Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference, which is coming up in January. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. So long.